All right, well, welcome everyone. Let me. And here, Kate, I'll let you get situated and then maybe bring this microphone closer to you. So that you're, are you comfortable?
I'm all good, yeah.
All right, and then we
Needs
can
to be
bring
low
it
down
up
because I'm short.
forward.
Okay.
All right, well, I want to begin by introducing you all to the Country Bookshop. The Country Bookshop was founded in 1953, and we have had a variety of really incredible owners over the years, and the pilot newspaper beginning in 2010. And it is through the devotion of the paper, but really it's our customers. It's y'all sitting here in front of us. It's y'all coming into our doors. It's our author community and publisher community partners that allow us to have these events, and y'all just spending money with us. I say this every time because I mean it. And for any of our, if you like downtown Southern Pines, if you like Broad Street, if you like the bookshop, you know, buy an ice cream cone or a t-shirt or something, because that's what keeps a town thriving. I want to welcome you for your return trip to Southern Pines. Kate was born in Peterborough, England, and studied English literature at the University of Warwick. Early in her career, she was a nonfiction editor at Penguin Random House, UK. In 2014, she became a freelance editor, author, and ghostwriter. And she wrote 11 books in 3 years. Some for you seem to allude to some very fancy people, and a lot of those ended up as bestsellers on the Sunday Times. In 2017, her book Radium Girls was published in America, and it was an immediate success, as many of you probably remember. It went straight on the New York Times bestseller list, and it was one of the top-selling books of history that year in America. Kate joined us in Southern Pines on that tour, where I had to miss it. I had a meeting, but so this is a treat for me, as much as it is for y'all. Radium Girls, just so y'all know, now has a young readers edition, which I think is very exciting. And we had some for this event, and they sold out because they're so popular. So we'll have plenty of those in. But I want to thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here, and welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be back. I have such lovely memories of the last time I was in Southern Pines. I don't know if any of you came to that event. Anyone come? Yeah? Thank you. So as people may know, Radium Girls is such a passionate project for me, and it's amazing to have found another project that I'm passionate about and to be able to come and talk to you all about it. So thank you for coming out, and thank you, Kimberly, for what we're about to do.
Well, I mean, your passion, I was wondering if you might open our conversation by reading the author's note that you just opened the book with.
Sure.
And how many of y'all have read the book?
Wow, thank
Okay,
you.
okay, all right, so
Thank
please.
you for reading. So this is the author's note from the woman they could not silence. This is not a book about mental health, but about how it can be used as a weapon. It's a historical book, and as the people about whom I've written use their own contemporaneous terms to describe madness, such as the insane and lunatics and maniacs, I have used them too, though they're clearly not acceptable or appropriate in the modern age. As I hope this book will make clear, they were always blanket terms anyway, too broad and all-encompassing ever to be useful or sensitive to truth. It's a non-fiction book. Everything in it is based on careful historical research. Every line of dialogue comes from a memoir, letter, trial transcript, or some other record made by someone who was present at the time. It's a book that is set over 160 years ago. A lot has changed. A lot hasn't. We are only just beginning to appreciate exactly how a person's powerlessness may lead to struggles with their mental health. And with that understanding, statistics showing higher rates of mental illness in women, people of colour, and other disenfranchised groups become translated into truth, not a biological deficiency, as doctors first thought. but a cultural creation that, if we wanted to, we could do something about. So in the end, this is a book about power, who wields it, who owns it, and the methods they use. And above all, it's about fighting back. Thank you.
I love that that's, when I first opened the book to read it, I read it again, took a picture of it, sent it to my best friend, then got a text message back from another friend because she had sent it to another friend, and they all wanted to buy the book. So,
Thank you.
but it's such a great entry into the story. And do you want, for those of you who haven't read it, maybe to just give your elevator pitch of the book? All of y'all signed up for this event, so I'm sure you know the basics, but just to ease us in.
Yeah, so the book is called The Woman They Could Not Silence, and it's about a woman called Elizabeth Packard. I suspect many of you, until you've read the book, have never heard her name before. Part of my mission in writing this book is to restore her legacy and the knowledge of what she went through, because she was a truly extraordinary person who literally changed the world, but no one knows her name. And that's partly because of what happened to her. So Elizabeth Packard in 1860 was committed to an insane asylum on the say-so of her husband. She was committed because she dared to have a mind of her own, essentially. And the story charts her battle to become the woman they could not silence. It's the story of a woman battling to find her voice, battling to be heard. And Elizabeth Packard is remarkable because despite all the many challenges she faces, as she's called crazy simply for being an assertive woman, she manages to find that voice and extraordinary things result.
So when she first gets to the asylum, and even today, I'm in meetings all the time, and whenever somebody calls in someone, it's always a woman, crazy, I immediately take it with a grain of salt, and I'm not actually thinking about the person they're calling crazy. I'm thinking about the human doing the calling, which intrigued me about this book. And it's been shocking that kind of as talking about this book, promoting this event over the last 6 months or so, a lot of the anecdotal conversations and just general knowledge about, you mentioned that nobody knows Elizabeth, but depending on the education or the reading you've done, you may be aware that traditionally in America and in England, women were put in asylums as a method of control, but it astounded me how many people were encountering this for the first time. And what I found interesting and what I want to lead into my question was that Elizabeth herself was surprised, as you wrote, when she went to the asylum to find a lot of sane people there. And I'd like for you to speak to some of the reasons at the time that were given and documented for people being put in there. And I have my quote here, but please, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, and this was actually one of the things that I found fascinating in researching the book. I wanted to write a book about how women are called crazy, and as you say, the fact that allegation is questionable and it's used as a method of control, as a method of power, as I wrote in that author's note. So yes, Elizabeth is stunned when she goes to the asylum. She wakes up the morning after she's been committed. She goes to the dining hall. Firstly, this is not an asylum ward as we would imagine it to be. It's a very cultural place. There are pictures on the walls, there's rugs on the floor, there's an oilcloth on the dining table. They're using glass and crockery. It's a civilized place. And the women she meets are sane. And we learn through Elizabeth and through the research that I've done and through reading even the psychiatrist's own notes, that these are women who've been sent to the asylum for causing the greatest annoyances to their families. These are women who've been sent away for defying all domestic control. And we can see even on the asylum's own records, some of the, to our mind, crazy reasons that these people are committed. My favourite, if favourite is the right phrase to use, is when I looked up the records of the Illinois State Hospital, and they published biennial reports that listed the causes of insanity in those who've been committed. And one of the reasons, 2 words, novel reading. Novel reading, reading books. Reading books was a cause of insanity. So, you know, you all are here at an author event. I'm sure we all read books. You know, we would be liable in the 19th century to be locked up. They thought that women reading books would drive them mad.
And thinking, lots of people were locked up for excessive application of mind.
Yeah, that's right. That's what Elizabeth was locked up for. That's what was on her medical notes. Excessive application of body and mind had driven her mad. There was something in the 19th century called moral insanity. And it basically was defined by the phrase eccentricity of conduct. If you acted eccentrically, you could be locked up. But of course, eccentricity of conduct, you know, like beauty, it's all in the eye of the beholder. And it meant women who were assertive or ambitious could be locked up, because to the 19th century doctors, that was eccentric conduct. You know, a woman in the 19th century was supposed to be satisfied with being a wife, being a mother, staying in the home. And any woman who wanted to push those boundaries, who longed for something more, any woman who wanted to study, to read, to, you know, be a public speaker, to do anything beyond being a wife and mother, you know, could be sent away. And it was essentially a phrase that I found in my research, a medicalization of female behavior. And that's ultimately what was happening. Any woman who acted in any way that was conceived as being different could be locked up in an asylum.
You know, you mentioned the list that you have of these reasons. And part of what, because of the way you write, what has made Radium Girls so successful and this so compelling is the women making that silence so compelling. Is not only the subject matter in your unveiling history, but the way you write. And it's so easy to be pulled into this story with the way you write, feeling like it's fiction, but the pictures and the photographic archives that are peppered throughout the book really do a great service in terms of bringing us back to what it is. And here we go. I can get to my question. I have it written down here. But it just brings a lot of the history. You're talking about people, and all of a sudden you see a picture of the man in question who, it reminds us, looks like, one of them looks like my brother. But or your neighbor. It's just a reminder, these are just people, and how close we are to history. You also have pictures of her writing, and you can imagine the secret journals and how economically you wrote. But as you're doing the research, I'm wondering if you wanted to talk to which photos you wanted to include, or also were you able to touch any of her personal papers? I know she did publish. Can you talk a little bit about those sources? I know you researched a lot, but just maybe expand on that as much as possible for us, because it's fascinating.
Absolutely. When, you know, research is one of my favorite things when I'm creating a book. And in terms of what ended up in the book, I'm going to see if I can find it. I probably won't be able to. The letter you described, that there is, okay, you have a look for it. So there is a letter of Elizabeth that I've reproduced in the book. And it's actually not a letter from her time in the asylum. It's from before then. And you'll see if Kimberly can find it. She writes all over the page. So she writes like a normal letter, and then she writes up the margins, then she writes along the top, then she writes down the other side, then she writes on the back of the envelope. And it just illustrates, firstly, how she was able to keep this secret journal in the asylum. So she was forbidden to write by the doctors. You know, it was too dangerous for a woman to have a pen, to have a voice. And Elizabeth, in particular, was a danger with a pen in her hand. You know, Elizabeth herself said, "My pen shall rage, even if my voice didn't." She was dangerous with a pen in her hand, and she kept this secret journal in the asylum where she would record the abuse that she's witnessing. Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. So you can vaguely see in there just how she crammed words onto the page. So yeah, she would keep this secret journal in the asylum, and she, in order to keep it, she would steal scraps of fabric from the sewing room. She would tear out the margins of newspapers and just scribble, whenever there was a blank space, she would record her thoughts. She would record the abuse that she's witnessing in the hospital. She is recording everything she's thinking and feeling as a sane woman in a mental hospital, as a woman who sees wrong all around her and is determined to make it right and make it better for people. And finding that letter, which I found in Massachusetts in a library, was just such a gift, because I was able to hold it with my bare hands, and that's just so extraordinary to think she has touched this paper that I'm now touching, to be able to see the way that she crammed her writing, even before she was locked up, she had so much to say that it just poured out of her. And to see the way that she was able to write so small and so cleverly illustrates how she was able to keep that journal that she kept just on little scraps that she buried in her bandbox and in her trunk to keep them safe for when she ultimately managed to find her freedom. So sources like that were incredibly special and illuminating. I also loved simply traveling to the places that she had lived. It was a very different experience from doing Radium Girls, which is 1920s and 1930s, when I can actually go into the buildings, and the landscape and the streets are so similar to how it was for the women. In Elizabeth's time, of course, it's 1860, and things are very different today. But I still found it incredible to, for example, go and worship at the church where her husband had preached. So I did go to Manteno, Illinois. I went to the church where her husband was the pastor. I went inside, I shared a Sunday service with the congregation. The pastor, incidentally, is now a woman. And that to me was just, absolutely brilliant. This church that had tried to silence a woman, now led by a woman. And she was so helpful. She shared the church's own records with me, some of the intriguing new information which had never been published before came from those church records. For those who have read the book, there's a whole political angle about why Elizabeth is locked up, why her husband wants to send her away. And the information that I found, was initiated by records that the church and the pastor shared with me that Sunday. So yeah, a wonderful thing. Just one final thing on the research I'll just mention quickly is I also traveled, of course, to the asylum site in Jacksonville, Illinois. And that, I think, was probably the most powerful part of my research trip. Like Elizabeth, I walked past the stone gateposts that mark the borders of the asylum grounds. They still stand. The stone is obviously incredibly old, it is crumbling, but the gateposts are still twice the height of a woman. They tower over you as you're standing next to them looking up. And there is a really, a very visceral sense of crossing over, of moving into that new environment, leaving behind the roar of civilization, moving into what is now the quiet of a community park. And there are just a few abandoned buildings dotted about. And I actually interviewed locals who told me they used to break into the abandoned insane asylum when they were teenagers. They take a flashlight in the dead of night and they creep through the long corridors, seeking out these, secrets of the insane asylum. And I moved them through the park, and Elizabeth writes in her books and in her journal about this infant orchard that's being planted. And of course, when I go there 160 years later, these trees have grown to maturity. And there's so many and so verdant, the wind whistles through them, and it sounds like a chorus of voices trying to be heard. What was really disappointing about that visit is the building in which Elizabeth had been held had been knocked down. So I couldn't go inside with my flashlight and, creep through the corridors in the dead of night. When they knocked it down, incidentally, they kept the limestone windowsills, because over the century and a half that the hospital had stood, the patients had etched messages into the windowsills, words, pictures, again, just these voices, trying to be heard. And, there were still secrets to be found. 4 years after the building was knocked down, they found this tranche of unmarked graves in the grounds. and they belong to the patients. I couldn't see the building, but I did peer through the windows of those auxiliary buildings that were left, and that was still really haunting because, you know, these buildings have not been touched for decades, and you can just see like the paint unfurling from the underside of the staircases. You can glimpse the orphan furniture that's been left behind, and the buildings are graffiti. Don't open, dead inside.
If you haven't read the book, I mean, you just listening to Kate, you can just imagine what a treat you're in. And it comes through, but it comes, I was so into it, and I can look at my next questions. You know, Elizabeth embodies over and over, no matter what circumstances she's in, she just puts her head down and does the work and finds a purpose, and no matter where she is, what she does, and that's part of the light and that she shines throughout, that you chronicle. At the beginning of your book is divided into parts, and I think it's part 2. You have a quote from her mother's obituary, and her mom's not mentioned really at all throughout the rest of the book, but I know you know all about her mother. The quote from the obituary of Lucy Strong Parsons Ware, the mother of Elizabeth Packard, her obituary in 1843, is, "She did not spend her time so much in doubting as in doing." I'm wondering if you, since we have the privilege of your presence here, could tell us more about Elizabeth's mother.
Yeah, well, I did obviously research as much as I could find out about her, and I used that quotation because I think it sums up Elizabeth herself. You know, she did not spend her time so much in doubting as in doing, and that is Elizabeth all over. So her mother, I mean, there's not a lot that I was able to find out because, you know, it was so long ago and my research was very much focused on Elizabeth. And because, you know, as a historian, you know, I don't like to actually think of myself as a biographer, because this is not a biography of Elizabeth Packard. This is a narrative about her journey from a particular, you know, point, that 9 years of her life that I focused on. And because Lucy had died in 1843 and the book is opening in 1860, I didn't spend a lot of time researching her. But she was an important influence in Elizabeth's life. Elizabeth wrote about her childhood in her books, and she wrote more about her father and the relationship that she had with him, and how the two of them would go, you know, up the mountain gathering blueberries together and things like that. She didn't actually write a lot about her mother. But you can see in Lucy's obituary, that quote, what an influence she had on Elizabeth. And it's important to say as well, the obituary also mentions that Lucy was a passionate woman, that she was very religious. You know, it talks about how if the religious sort of fervor would take her, she would, you know, spend days sobbing in her closet. You know, she'd be overcome with a sort of religious passion at times. And you know, part of what drives Elizabeth to strike out on her own and to become this independent woman is she starts to question the faith and the creed that her husband is preaching, and that encourages her to read more and to develop her own relationship with God. And we can see in her mother's relationship with God that, you know, Lucy as well felt very passionate about her faith, and that is mirrored in her daughter's journey and what Elizabeth goes on to do.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Bible essays and how that just...
Absolutely. So the Bible essays were written by Elizabeth before she goes to the asylum. There's a Bible class that starts to run in her husband's church about 4 months before Elizabeth is committed in June 1816. And my understanding, having done my research, is that these Bible classes were initiated by the church because the church had switched its creed. It used to be a new school church, and they received some funding from a very wealthy donor, Cyrus McCormick, and he says you can only have this money, which would give them a permanent church building for the first time. You can only have this money if you switch your creed to old school. And that was a political decision because he was hoping to avoid a civil war, and old school was ambivalent about abolition, whereas new school is pro-abolition. Now, Elizabeth was pro-abolition, so the idea that suddenly you're supposed to believe something else, that you're not, you're supposed to sit on the fence when it comes to this, such a critical contemporary issue, sits very uneasily with her. She attends the Bible classes, she does have permission to attend them, and at first she is very reticent to contribute. She writes, "I felt so small somehow sitting in that classroom. I felt that nothing I said was worth saying or hearing," but she gets over that pretty quickly. And she writes her essays, she writes them down because even at this early stage, the fact that she's questioning what the church is now preaching, the fact that she's daring to speak back, to have an alternative viewpoint, has already started the whispers among the community that this is a mad woman, that there's something not right with her mentally. And so she records her thoughts, her reactions to the issues they're discussing in class on paper, because she doesn't want to be quoted out of context. She wants to have a record of what she thinks at that time. And these essays ultimately become her salvation, because she is committed to the hospital. She spends years there, but remarkably, she does ultimately, manage to get out, and she embarks on this landmark legal case to try to prove her sanity. Now, of course, a lot of people think there's no smoke without fire. She's been held in the asylum for years. Okay, she seems sane now, sitting before us in the courtroom, but perhaps there was truth of it back in the day. And of course, at this stage, Elizabeth can produce the Bible class essays where her common sense views are there in black and white, and she can prove to the class, to the court, that she is sane, and there is the evidence in her own hand that she was never mad at all.
That section in the book really reads like a movie, like a trial in a movie. It was such a pleasure to read. And so much of Elizabeth's work as she leaves the trial, her lobbying for these laws, the beginning of not only some accountability and structure in the asylum community, but also in the democratization of marriage across the country. Can you put that trial into context for us, and why was it significant to actually have the opportunity to have your sanity tried as opposed to the alternative?
Yeah, I mean, this was completely unique that a woman had a trial in Illinois to prove her sanity. The law at the time essentially said that a wife was her husband's property and he could do with her as he wished. So other people, men especially, would get a trial before they were committed where their sanity would be discussed. But in the case of married women, their husbands by law had the right to send them to asylums simply by request, and specifically without the evidence of insanity that was required in other cases. That is a quote from the statute books. That's the power that men had over their wives. So they were not supposed to have a trial at all. And Elizabeth is lucky, really, that, I won't spoil it. How she gets the trial is one of my favourite bits of the book, and I won't spoil it for you by describing how that comes to be. But this was a unique landmark trial for a married woman to have this opportunity to have her say in court and for her sanity to be discussed. And it does ultimately, because her court case becomes a cause célèbre, and ultimately it leads to change in the laws so that other wives are not oppressed as Elizabeth is. So it has a really, a real legacy to it, as always happens with Elizabeth Packard, because she's a very altruistic woman. She doesn't use her brilliance to save herself. She ensures she uses her brilliance to save a whole sisterhood of women. And so it's never enough for Elizabeth just to make things right for her. She has to battle to make things better for everyone.
Well, it's full circle to your author's note. It's sanity is a cultural creation, and I love that the result of Elizabeth's life includes the cultural creation, shifting the cultural creation into something else. There's so much about the field of psychology peppered throughout the book at that time, and the far-reaching implications I think it might be in your epilogue or something, where it comes into today.
Yeah.
But you referenced Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, the senior surgeon at the London Surgical Home, and his FGM as a cure for insanity. And you have several other references to English asylums. Two questions. Was the same thing happening in England? And also, I'm just, even more so, was the average person, just to circle back to my question in the beginning, was the average person at the time aware of this? I mean, you outlined so much as Elizabeth shone a light in different things, but just how can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so my research did touch on some British asylums as well as American asylums, and you're right, I do quote from some of that research. The thing that seemed notable that I uncovered is that there was more experiments happening in Europe. American asylums, particularly as the 19th century developed, they were so overrun and overcrowded that American psychologists and psychiatrists tended to be almost caretakers of these, mammoth communities, really. And they really were communities. Some of them had their own dairy farms, they had their own fire crews to, look after just the asylum grounds. And so the superintendents were responsible for managing all of that. So, the historical analysis of American psychiatry in the 19th century is generally it inherited from Europe the new ideas and the new techniques and things like that, because there was no time for American psychiatrists to experiment. So that's what historians say about that particular era when I dug into it. As for what did the average person know about some of these horrific treatments that were happening to women in the modern, in the contemporary era, I think the average person on the street didn't know about it. I mean, we can see Elizabeth's shock as she actually gets into the asylum to realise what it's like. Firstly, to realise that so many sane women have been committed like her, but also to realise the abuse and the degradation that's happening to some of the other patients, where there are no pictures on the walls and things like that. It is a literal sort of hellhole on earth. This is where people are supposed to be sent away to get better. She's shocked because she always thought the Illinois State Hospital was where you would go if you were, afflicted, obviously mentally rather than physically, and that just as someone would cure a broken leg, you'd be sent there to have your mind cured. And in the mid-19th century, they did genuinely believe that an asylum could offer cure. This was a restful place to go. These were beautiful grounds, they were beautiful buildings. The ideal was that someone would be sent away, they'd have their time to rest, and they'd get better, they'd have medical care, and care being the word. She wanted people, she expected there to be loving care rather than the abuse that she witnesses, the way they're trying to, corral women into being obedient wives, to crush the spirit out of them. She's stunned by what she witnesses, even within her own asylum. So I have no doubt that the average person on the street had no idea about some of the surgical treatments that were happening, because even the abuse that she's witnessing is, not what she hopes. And it's worth saying as well that I think that situation also applies in our modern lives. As I was researching, we all hope that mental hospitals will be places we can send our loved ones when, they need help beyond what we can offer at home. But as I was researching, there were more cases coming out. This was particularly in the UK as I was watching the news, but, attendants abusing patients and things like that. And essentially it comes back to the author's note. It's about power. And whenever you have vulnerable people and attendants, guards, whoever in power over them, that leaves you open to an abuse of power. And that we still see today happening, even though we wish it wouldn't.
Power and accountability. And before we open it up for questions, it also is such a hopeful story, because the core, it's power and accountability, but what we see Elizabeth Packard do is the core of our democracy, her changing laws, her lobbying, her speaking to leaders, getting petitions, signatures, and chipping away human by human, law by law, state by state, until the end of the book really is quite hopeful. And it's in the journey of one human with purpose, I think is very a great gift.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something that, encouraged me to choose her story to write about is, despite all the dark things that we've discussed this afternoon, those who read the book will know, this is actually a book with a happy ending, believe it or not. So it is worth persevering through all the darkness. And I think even through the darkness, Elizabeth's spirit still shines. She writes that, when she's in the asylum and she's been robbed, of her home, her family, she had an 18-month-old when she was sent to the asylum. She had 6 children in total that, she was stolen from. So she's lost family, she's lost her home, she's lost her reputation. And she says, the worst that my enemies can do, they have done. And I fear them no more. I am now free to be true and honest. No opposition can overcome me. And she rises like this phoenix from the ashes of her former life. And through this crucible of horrendous suffering, she becomes the woman they could not silence. And I don't think she'd have become that woman without what she went through. And her shining spirit offers such light, even in the darkest of times in this book, in her life. And it is a hopeful ending. It is, I think, an inspirational story. And I actually think her greatest legacy is not the laws that she changed, remarkable as that was for her to do in her time. I think her greatest legacy is the example she sets for all of us as people, to fly, to soar, to believe in ourselves, no matter what anyone else is telling us about who we are and what we're capable of. Only you know what you can be. Only you know who you are inside. And Elizabeth shows us that if you believe in yourself and you follow your heart and your dreams and your own personal mission in life, amazing things can happen.
I have read the book and I can't tell you how it moved me. Truth points.
Would you like a microphone?
I said, oh.
Everyone wants to hear.
A couple of things when you said continue. I believe it was Theophilus who had his wife committed during menopause and she never got out. And 100 years from the time you're talking about, I believe Netflix is doing something about this now. Martha Mitchell was married to a political man and voiced her opinion about the Vietnam War. He had her committed in the 1960s.
That's right. She actually was the first person to whistleblow about Watergate.
Yes.
Yeah, she's very briefly mentioned in the epilogue. Martha is, and actually her name is now synonymous with psychiatrists who don't believe people when what they're saying is true. She was the first person to say that, Watergate went all the way to the White House and Nixon was implicated. And you're right, she was, psychiatrically locked up and subdued with tranquilizers and so on and so forth. And yeah, I think it's Julia Roberts is about to play her. I think it's called Gaslit, is it? Yeah.
So one last thing. I was married in 1967. I lived independently. I supported myself. I got married in 1967, and the day I got married, I was not allowed to hold a credit card in my name.
Yeah.
I was not allowed to own property. I was not allowed to do 1967.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't until 1974 that law was overturned. And I talk about that, when I do my author talk, because the law that I described about Elizabeth being able to be sent away by her husband's request is exactly the same law. It was called coverture, basically, inherited from England. We Brits have a lot to answer for. And it basically said exactly, women, the law said the husband and the wife are one, and that one is the husband. It meant women were just shadows of their spouses. They had no legal rights at all. You had no civic identity. That was why you couldn't hold a credit card. You couldn't hold property. You had no right to the custody of your children because you were no one. You know, how could a shadow have a credit card? You know, that the wife did not exist in law. And I always mention that 1974 law that finally gave women, you know, the chance to have a credit card independently, because until then, a man would have to co-sign any credit application, and as you say, you just couldn't get it. Yeah, yeah.
Talking about having women committed, I didn't even break down, I freaked out. I had nightmares about losing my independence at that point.
Yeah.
My husband supported me, but the fact that the law did not was just.
Yeah, and like you were one of the lucky ones. Your husband supported you, and find yourself in a situation like Elizabeth, and it's not the case. And you know, it's worth saying that I've had so many readers contact me. I even met a reader when I was in Illinois the other day, and she came up to me, and she was like you know, really emotionally invested in the story. It personally affected her so deeply. And she said to me, in 2016, my husband got me psychiatrically committed for 3 days in her case, but he still had the power to do it. And she's not the only reader that's contacted me to say, you know, within the last 5 years, this has happened to them.
Please, and I would just repeat your question so everyone can hear.
I'm curious how you found her, and I'm also curious what you're writing next.
How you found her and what you're writing next.
Yeah, so how I found her is, it's a really topsy-turvy story, I think, because I didn't know anything about Elizabeth at all. And what inspired me to write this book was not finding her story. I was actually inspired to write the book through the Me Too movement of 2017. And what struck me about that time with, you know, women speaking up, speaking out against misogyny, sexual harassment, rape, what I found interesting about that time was not that women were speaking up, because we always have. It was that finally we're being listened to and believed. That was the critical difference about Me Too. When we said, you know, someone had raped us or sexually attacked us, finally we were being listened to, no matter who they were, you know, even if they were the king of Hollywood, you know, finally when someone said something, it was believed. And that got me thinking, how have women been silenced in the past? And I realized, you know, for centuries, whenever we've used our voices, we've been called crazy. And I decided that was what I wanted to write about. But I didn't want to write a polemic. I wanted to find one woman's story in history through whose personal story I could take readers on a journey, and you could get to know her and what happened to her. And, you know, you see the politics through her personal experience, and only at the end, hopefully take a step back and realize, hang on, this is still happening. This is happening in my life. I can see how this happens in society today. And so I basically went looking for a woman I could write about. And I didn't know what period of history it was. I actually started in the 1950s and 1960s and looking for stories there. But I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth's story has a happy ending. The stories I found in the 1950s and 1960s, and I did find stories because this happened throughout history, but they were all depressing. These women were lobotomized. You know, they had electric shock therapies. They were silenced when they were psychiatrically attacked. And so I had to go further back, and in a University of Wisconsin essay that I just randomly found online that was about lunacy in the 19th century, 4 pages into it, there was a single paragraph with a reference to a woman called Elizabeth Packard. And that was the first time I found her name. And I then Googled her and found this incredibly dramatic story with all the courtroom drama and, you know, the Gothic horror of the insane asylums of the 19th century. And I found her, and I found her books. And the moment I discovered that, you know, these incredible first-person accounts that would enable me to write the personal, novelistic, non-fiction narratives that I like to write, that I can quote from her, so you know from her, in her own words, what she's thinking and feeling. Well, that was it. I was sold that she was the one that I wanted to write about next. In terms of what I'm doing next, I'm researching ideas at the moment. I haven't settled on one topic yet. I'm doing essentially what I think of as my due diligence. You know, is this idea something that speaks to me? Do I feel passionate about it? If yes, has any book been written about it before? Is there enough first-person material that I can craft that intimate narrative that I want to write? So I'm doing all of that digging at the moment before settling on a subject. So, thank you.
Can you tell us how long it took you to do the research for the book?
Yeah, so the question is, how long did it take me to do the research? So I made a note in my diary when I first read Elizabeth's name, because I thought, I just had a tingling in my bones that this might be interesting. So it was the 15th of January 2018, and I delivered my first draft 4th of March 2020. Just over 2 years. Most of that is the research. I write really quickly. I wrote the book in about 6 weeks.
And do you have a staff that helps you research?
Say that again.
Do you have a staff that helps you research?
Oh, no. Do I have a staff that helps me research? No, it's just me. Just me. Hello.
I've been here about 23, 24 years. And when I first came, I began learning about the girls of Samarkand. And that's maybe, you got it? Oh, is that, you know, this kind of brought it together for me. And so if anybody here doesn't know about the story, you really need to go to your internet, look it up, maybe go to the library, go to the bookstore.
That's what we're waiting for.
Because it is more local. It is what really truly happened here. And matter of fact, these girls set their dormitory on fire and trying to escape and things like that. So I found that quite.
Well, there are 2 books at the bookshop that we have. One I brought here, The Wayward Girls of Samarkand, and there's another. But, you know, it's interesting. The Pilot newspaper, whose office we're in, they say, the Pilot, you'll never find any national news in there. But there's a saying around the office, if you look for it, there is a local angle to every single national news story. And as we do these author events and, you know, peel back layers of history, there's always, and it comes out usually in the author signing, somebody coming up and telling a story, and there's always, everything's local, you know, unfortunately, the Samarkand, I was gonna bring it too, but.
I don't know the story. Can you summarize it for me?
I'll let you. Let me
Summarize it. Oh, I don't know if I can, because you know, it's been 24 years.
It's our local assignment.
It's from the 1920s, 1930s here. And it was like a huge mansion or dormitory that these girls were brought from all over the state of North Carolina. And they were institutionalized from being pregnant, for quitting school, for
reading novels,
whatever,
maybe.
for whatever that they were put there. And there were many of them. I'm thinking 50 or so. And so it's the treatment, it's what they felt, it's their feeling imprisoned is what they felt. And they tried for their freedom, and they set the place on fire to draw attention to their being there like that. And it's history.
Yeah,
it's our history.
And as we said, you know, I'm writing about the 1860s. This is 1920s, 1930s. This is happening throughout history again and again.
So much of our local lore is when F. Scott Fitzgerald would come in on the train and stumble up to Weymouth to hang out with the Boyds. And the reason he was in North Carolina is because Zelda, as we know, was in the asylum in Asheville at the time. He would pop down to party with, to party in Southern Pines.
If I'm not mistaken, Samarkand was open until something like 1974, and that was when I was in the 70s before they closed it down.
The experiment.
Yeah.
It has something to do now with the state troopers, the horse, the North Carolina Guard, you know, the horse guard. Yeah, that's what's out there now.
Oh, but on the building.
A part of it burned out.
Any more questions? Please.
In your research, looking at the society and culture of the 19th century, Was there any difference throughout society of the class of women that would affect who would be sent away, and perhaps lower class women would simply be beaten by their husbands?
That's a really interesting question. So the question was about the class of the women committed, and were there differences in the class of those women who were sent away by their husbands. The first point I'll make is that psychiatrists kept the women separated by class. So this is why when Elizabeth first goes to the asylum, she is surrounded by middle class women. They are the ones who are sent to the privileged ward. And that was because psychiatrists believed that if you mixed middle class women with lower class women, whom they called vulgar and obscene, that it would affect the middle class women's cure. They would be so shocked by, the defilement that they would hear with the obscene language and so on, that it would affect them getting better. So they kept the classes segregated within the asylum. From Elizabeth's account, the women that she meets in the lower wards, where the working class women are sent, seem to have more genuine mental illness. But I would also say I can think of, a handful of examples off the top of my head that are still working class women who were sent away by their families. So I think it did still happen, but psychiatry of the era did, it was partly based on class. There were they talked about how only certain civilized classes could even be afflicted by mental illness, that they would have the advanced sort of mental capacity in order to run mad. And they thought that some other people, and in particular, they were talking about, Black people and ethnic minorities, they hadn't attained the correct level of mental development in order to allow them to run mad. That was part of the, insane racist ideology of psychiatry at the time. So that also applied to class as well. So there were working class people in the asylum, but they were kept segregated, and I think there were different reasons for them being sent away. But as I say, I can think of just a handful of examples from the lower ward of working class women who were with Elizabeth, who had been sent away for causing annoyances to the family, or husbands who wanted to send them. Many of the women were physically abused as well as psychiatrically abused. So we do see that in the asylum as well. Elizabeth talks about a woman who arrives with half the hair, pulled out of her head by her husband. And even though the husband is obviously violent, he's a drunk, his word is listened to, more than the word of this woman who's been attacked. And all of this feeds into Elizabeth's desire to make things right, and her realization that the asylum is not the sanctuary that she thought, it's not the hospital that she thought where people could get better. It's essentially a receptacle for all of those who were troublesome to society.
But she did phenomenally devoted work to her day, to trying to make their lives better. She wasn't concerned with her own life as much as she was also theirs.
Absolutely. And we're talking about, hands-on practical application to improve the lives of others, literally washing patients who were dirty, combing their hair, giving them, an affectionate caress if they're wanting a hug. Many of them were so, almost locked in by what had happened and the abuse they'd experienced, that she helped coax them out and restore their humanity to them.
I keep wanting to list my quotes that I have them written in my notes, please.
I'm sorry, I haven't read the book yet, so maybe
That's
you
all right.
address this, but what about divorce? That wasn't an alternative for the man?
Well, it was. I mean, divorce laws at that time did exist, and it was an option, but it was an option with a lot of social stigma involved. So it was easier for men, particularly a man like Elizabeth's husband, who was a preacher. The idea of a preacher getting divorced, I mean, that, he'd have lost all social standing, all religious, spiritual standing if he divorced his wife. Far easier to send her to an asylum. And with the divorce laws as they were, the asylum was just the easier option, send her away and, don't have to think about her anymore. So
The other book that when I was looking forward to accompany this, I realized it doesn't come out yet on, I believe, the 14th or something of June. A book's coming out, nonfiction, called Divorce Colony, which is about, I cannot pronounce it, but Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which had the most progressive around this time divorce laws on the book. And so, but you had to stay there for like 3 months before you get approved. So everybody would take the train west and stay there. And so that's coming out. I will put it display. Wayward Girls, Women They Could Not Silence, and Divorce Cons.
Yeah.
Come in.
Please.
I really enjoyed the book, and I was glad that it had a happy ending. But my heart just broke for those children. And as a mother, I just think you were doing greater good. You were, giving up your children for women all around the world. But it still makes my heart hurt. Your children did not fare well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's never forget that this is, so yeah, to repeat the question, it was about the children, Elizabeth's children, and the lady was saying how her heart breaks for them, and yes, Elizabeth was doing it for the greater good, but they didn't have the benefit of her mothering. Let's not forget that it was the husband's decision to send her away, so he is ultimately at fault. And someone asked me the other day, well, why did he send her away? Didn't that mean he had to look after the kids? Well, in their case, Elizabeth had one daughter who was a 10-year-old called Libby at the time she sent away, and the responsibility falls on Libby's shoulders. So no, he didn't have to look after the kids. Libby looked after the kids, the younger siblings, to the detriment of her mental health, lest it not be forgotten. And people have said to me as well, why didn't Elizabeth just fake it to get out? The only way to get out of the asylum was to become an obedient wife, to give up your sense of self, to confess that, husband is be all and end all, and he was right to send you away. And, what's been done is absolutely fine and it's right. And I will go home with my tail between my legs, and I will never, look you in the eye again, and I will never raise my voice again. And even faking it, Elizabeth could not do that. It would be just such a betrayal of who she was. She had done nothing wrong. It was her husband at fault. And as well, I think that, the more time she spends in the asylum, she does realize that there is work here to be done. There are people to be rescued. And for her, she could not betray herself, her faith, even to fake it. It would have been wrong. She was a truthful woman. She was an honest woman. She would not betray that faith and that truth by lying. And so for her, even though it could have got her home to her children, what kind of example would that have set? What would it have been like to be at home? Her husband didn't want her at home, even if she faked it to get out. It just would have been a life that, he wouldn't have let her mother the children as she wanted to mother them anyway. But ultimately, she was just such a strong person that she could not countenance, kowtowing, submitting. And I talked earlier about, the crucible of suffering that she rises from. One of my favorite quotes in the book is when she's talking about this subduing treatment, the fact she's been sent to the asylum to be broken in. And she says, in my case, this woman crushing machinery works the wrong way. The true woman shines brighter and brighter under the process instead of being strangled. And the more they oppressed her, the stronger Elizabeth became, and the more determined she became to get out on her own terms. She would not submit. She would go back to her children when she could, but she would return as herself and not a shadow of herself.
I think we need to close on that, because I have been certain. That's why I keep going back to my notes, because that is the quote for me as well.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for being here, and I want to thank you all for we'll be back at this table signing books. I'll be there selling them on my phone. I know some of you have already gotten them and have them to be signed, but even if you already have your books, if we could just do one line, that would I think make things run smoothly. Yes.
I just want to say I'm looking forward to reading Kate's new next book, No Pressure.
Thank
And we do have some more upcoming events that I hope you'll join us for. I of course forgot the flyers, but Taylor Brown's coming, Joy Calloway. We have May, Mary Kay Andrews, May. I hope I see y'all, because I'm going to be working my tail off, because we have so many great authors coming. So I hope I see y'all and all of them. So thank you. So she comes.
Thank you.